happens is workers' comp, yeah, your premium can go up a little bit. But if you're facing a personal injury lawsuit for a child who was killed on the job, that could be financially catastrophic. So I think that has real potential to deter violations.
We have on our guest Terri Gerstein, director of the Wagner Labor Initiative at New York University. Really excited about talking to you about this new report. Terri, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited for the conversation.
Can you give people just kind of an overview of what the Wagner Labor Initiative at NYU was seeking to do with this report?
So the Wagner Labor Initiative at NYU tries to help state and local governments in particular build their capacity to advance and protect workers' rights in a whole range of ways, through enforcement, through policy. And what I was hoping to do with this report, I feel like this is really a moment where we know that the federal government is not protecting workers. There are policy rollbacks. There's shrinkage of the federal government. And yet there's so much that state and local governments can do to protect workers and to stand up for workers. And so really, I think it's a moment for state and local government to be bold, to take action, and to pass laws, to implement things in ways, to really keep workers at the center of like all of the government activities. And so what I was hoping to do with this report, it's really a compendium of a number of laws that have passed, mostly at the state level, a few are local, in the past several years, that have actually passed in some jurisdictions. So they're not like pie in the sky, unrealistic. A lot of times state legislators or local legislators want to know, has this passed elsewhere? What would language look like? So the goal of this report was just to sort of lay out a whole bunch of positive policy actions that have happened in recent years that help at the state and local level, that really help to make sure that workers are treated with dignity and fairness, and that workers are, at the center of some of the government action.
The title of the report is Issue Brief 2025 State Workers' Rights Roundup, Policy Opportunities from Recent Legislative Sessions. We've put a link to it in the chat on YouTube and Facebook if folks would like to see it, and we'll include a link to it in our weekly newsletter as well. Can you tell us what were some of the standout, state and local law developments that you found the most exciting in the report?
Absolutely. And before I go into that, I just want to offer a caveat, which is some of the standout developments I did not go into because they're sort of things that everyone knows about. Raising the minimum wage, passing paid sick leave. And in some more worker hostile jurisdictions, this happened just for public employees, right? Local government or state government passed paid family leave or paid sick leave for their own employees. But
Alabama did that actually last legislative session. They passed paid parental leave for teachers for the first time ever.
Terrific, just terrific, right? And some places you can, obviously when you're talking about state or local work, there are so many different political landscapes. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind. And in the report also, there's a huge amount of leverage from procurement, from state and local government procurement, to infuse it with really high job quality standards, and make sure that government money is being spent on creating really good, solid jobs. And so that is also something that I think is sort of more widely familiar to people, and also a very in-depth topic that this report doesn't cover, but I just want to highlight. But some of the things that are in the report that I was trying to really focus on some things that people might not all be widely familiar with. Some of the ones that I am most excited by, one of them is that a couple of states have passed laws requiring workers' rights education in public high schools. California passed this in 2023. New Jersey just passed it. And this is really exciting to me because I think that, there's so much research showing that people do not know about their rights at work. And this is something, school curricula have become such a, culture war battleground. And this is something that I think we can all agree on, that when people start out their work lives, they should know about their minimum wage and overtime rights. They should know about the right to a safe workplace, about the right to form and join unions. And I don't think that education is something that will, solve all of our problems. But I think the current lack of knowledge about workers' rights is a terrible, terrible starting place that's like very disempowering for workers. So that's one that I especially liked. Another one is, a couple of other ones. One is unemployment insurance for striking workers, because they should be able to have some financial support while they're out of work, just like any other workers who are currently not having income. Washington and Oregon just passed this. New York has this as well, and New Jersey. Also, laws that expand the pool of enforcers. We don't have enough resources to enforce our, wage and hour and workplace safety and all of the, misclassification, all of the laws. The agencies to enforce these laws have been absolutely starved for decades.
Mm.
And this gives, a red carpet for corporations just to run roughshod over people's rights. And so there have been some examples in about half a dozen states. They have explicitly made wage theft a felony. And what that does is that expands the pool of enforcers, because that makes these cases more appealing to district attorneys or county attorneys or, criminal prosecutors. I always say if a worker embezzles from the employer, no one questions whether that's a criminal case and that gets
Right.
prosecuted. If the employer does not pay workers and steals their wages, that is much less frequently prosecuted, but that is changing in a number of jurisdictions, and passing laws that make wage theft a felony is a valuable part of that. Some states have also passed laws. California passed a law, and Minnesota, that allow local government to play a bigger role in enforcing not just whatever their local laws are, but enforcing the state's labor laws. So expanding the pool of enforcers, workers' rights education, unemployment insurance for striking workers, and of course, heat standards are another one that I think is so important as temperatures rise, keeping people safe. So those are a few, but there's really so many. And I tried to include a broad range that, might be relevant in a range of different jurisdictions, recognizing again that there's so much variation.
Yeah, there's so many. I mean, do you have off the top of your head like how many different policies you were able to? It's like, is it like 50 almost? I mean, it's a lot.
I think I didn't number them like that, but I think it's certainly in that ballpark. Yes, it's certainly in that ballpark. And again, not including raising the minimum wage, passing paid sick leave in various forms. And there are some that are squarely targeting collective bargaining and expanding
Hmm.
collective bargaining, like expanding collective bargaining to workers who are not covered by the National Labor Relations Act, like farm workers or public sector workers. And then New York and California both passed, what some people are talking about as trigger ordinances that sort of say, okay, the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, doesn't have a quorum and is being starved and is not, for a variety of reasons, is not really working to protect workers' right to organize. And so they passed state level laws saying, like, okay, the federal government is not really protecting workers' right to organize. If certain actions in California, it's basically like if the NLRB, is not really working for certain specific reasons, then the state labor relations law kicks in and workers would have a right to organize under state law. So those are some innovations that I think, again, that I think is more realistic in like very
Hmm.
worker friendly jurisdictions. But I think it's worth noting that, these laws are being seriously discussed in a number of jurisdictions.
I want to talk about a couple of those that have passed in more worker friendly jurisdictions that I unfortunately don't think we'll be able to get in Alabama, but that are particularly relevant for labor fights that we have had in Alabama, and things that if these laws had been in place, things may have gone a little bit differently. And one of those is the worker freedom of conscience laws. And you talk about in the brief how those laws are generally billed as banning captive audience meetings, but they're actually a lot broader than that. Can you talk about the scope of these freedom of conscience laws and where they've been instituted?
Yes, there's a number of states that have passed these freedom of conscience laws, including New York, where I am based. And basically, what they say, everybody always describes them as banning captive audience meetings, but they're really much broader than that. And basically, what they say is that workers cannot be retaliated against for not attending a meeting, the sole purpose of which is for the employer to talk about their own political or religious views. And so when you think about it that way, it's much broader, captive audience meetings, it's one form of an employer talking about their political views related to unionizing. But really, when you look at the language of these statutes, they're much broader than that. And I don't have at the top of my head the complete list of jurisdictions that have passed it, but they are all generally worker-friendly jurisdictions. And I should note also that these laws are being litigated. Employers have challenged these laws in several jurisdictions.
Hey, 5 seconds, just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
Another one is the minor protection laws, and this is particularly relevant. I don't know if you remember, but a few years ago there was some big reporting out of Reuters about undocumented migrant children as young as 12 being found to be working in the automotive supply chain in Alabama. And, obviously nothing was done about that by the state. The attorney general of the state never even commented on it. I mean, I followed that like pretty closely, and it was shocking that, the chief law enforcement officer in the state not talking about the blatant violation of Alabama's child labor law. I mean, that's illegal under Alabama law for 12-year-olds to be working in manufacturing environments, but he doesn't care about that, right? And so but in Alabama, they have considered weakening, and they did actually weaken the state's already sort of lax child labor laws. Not as bad as some other states, but in states that are different than Alabama, they're actually increasing protection for children. Can you talk to us about those?
Sure. So a couple of examples of those. One is in Illinois. Illinois had a real overhaul of its child labor laws, including increasing the penalties for violations. And then one change in laws that I think has a lot of promise to deter child labor violations happened in Colorado. And what they passed in Colorado, usually when a person is injured at work, the only thing they can do is they can get workers' compensation if they're injured or killed. They can't typically file a lawsuit for personal injury. And what they passed in Colorado was that if a child is killed on the job in Colorado, that the family, the survivors, I'm not remembering right now whether it also includes severe injuries, but certainly when children are killed on the job in Colorado, if the child labor laws are being violated at the time that the child is killed on the job, that the family is not limited to workers' compensation and can file a personal injury lawsuit. And so I think that has real power for deterrence, because if you're an employer, that really changes the calculus of your potential, exposure, financial exposure, if there's a violation. If all that happens is workers' comp, your workers' comp premium can go up a little bit, but that's not catastrophic. But if you're facing a personal injury lawsuit for a child who is killed on the job, that could be financially really catastrophic. So I think that has real potential to deter violations.
In your brief, you do say that when minors are employed in violation of child labor laws and injured or killed. So it seems like injury or death would qualify somebody for that expanded liability for the employer. And so, so we talked at the beginning about kind of the message of the report, and the message of the report is that there are things that workers and allies can be doing on the state and local level to advance workers' rights, even under a Trump administration. And that's always been the case. And, I feel like this isn't the first kind of state and local labor policy roundup that I've seen from you and from the Wagner Labor Initiative. And so those are always great. And that's it. I mean, frankly, it's important even under Democratic administration is to make gains where you can, when you can, at all of the levels that you can, because someday, it might become a little bit harder. But for workers and allies in states like Alabama, where we have pretty broad preemption, there was when there was a big fight to raise the minimum wage nationally to $10.10 an hour, Birmingham actually raised its minimum wage, and at that point, the state legislature passed a preemption law that I think it was pretty. I'm not sure if it was as broad as Texas's, but every time I mention something at the local level, somebody says, "Oh, well, that's preempted. That's preempted. We can't do that." And so, for folks like myself, what are opportunities that remain open even with preemption on the local level for municipalities to intervene in a positive way?
So that's a really good question. I want to just, before I answer that specific question, I want to note that there still is possibility for positive change at the state level, even in hostile environments. For example, there have been bans on non-competes. That is an area where there have been, very traditionally, not so supportive of worker states that have passed bans on non-competes in the past several years. That is an issue that seems to cross party lines. And then also in some places, as I noted in the report, in some places there have been ballot initiatives that has been a really good tool for passing, voters really support raising the minimum wage and really support raising, paid sick leave, for example. In Alaska, they also got the ban on, the freedom of conscience law through a ballot initiative. And so that's another method of, the legislators can try to roll it back, but that's another method of trying to achieve change, even in states that are not so friendly. But as you mentioned, there's an awful lot that localities can do, even where there's preemption. One initial point I would make is to not assume that there's preemption of everything, until you actually look into that specific policy. For example, heat standards. In some places, Texas has the Death Star bill where everything is preempted unless the legislature specifically allows cities to do it. But other states aren't necessarily like that. And so with a heat standard, for example, that might not yet be preempted. And if a locality passed a heat standard right at the end of a legislative session, with a relatively quick effective date, right? Employers could get used to the measures involved in having a heat standard. It's really pretty simple. It's, rest, shade, drinking water, having a plan in advance, training people. It's really not rocket science. And so if employers get used to this, then, they might realize that this is actually feasible. And then by the time the next legislative session comes around, there might be less opposition to, less motivation for preempting it. So that's one point. But other points are that local government has a lot of power. The power to legislate is only one slice of the pie of the power that local government has. They have the power, for example, procurement, to say we are not going to procure from any businesses. We're not going to enter contracts with any businesses that have a history of unremedied wage theft violations. And so Austin and Columbus and Cleveland have laws like this. For example, Austin has a wage theft coordinator who makes sure that Austin does not contract with known bad actors. Local governments can also publish information about violators within their jurisdiction. The New York City Comptroller created this amazing dashboard that shows all of the violations under the federal wage and hour law, anti-discrimination laws, safety and health, unionization, all the violations by employers within New York City. And so that's really useful for organizers to know, for job seekers to know what kind of employer they're applying to, for procurement officers to know who the government's doing business with. Another really big piece of leverage that I'm very excited about that's sort of like, I think state and local government really is a great place for experimentation. And there is using licensing and permitting as a lever for improving labor compliance. So in California, there are two counties, Santa Clara and San Diego, that have basically said if you, restaurant, have you have wages that the state says that you owe, and you have not paid them back, and you still owe that money, we're going to reach out to you. We're going to send you a couple of increasingly angry letters. And if you don't pay, we're going to suspend your license and you can't do business. They've had a really good success rate of getting the money paid back that way. And I think the more that word gets out in that community, it can, in the regulated, industry, it can help deter violations. Boston has a really cool ordinance related to the construction industry, where basically, in order to get a building permit in the first place for projects above a certain size, before you can even cross go, right? Contractors have to submit a site-specific workplace safety affidavit outlining all of the hazards and how they're going to address it, making sure that all the workers are trained, and have the appropriate OSHA training, and several other measures as well. And then that site-specific workplace safety affidavit is incorporated into the building permit. And if they're not complying with it in the course of building, when the building inspectors go there, there can be consequences for the permitting. So I feel like local governments have a lot of power. They issue licenses in a lot of different counties and cities, issue licenses in a lot of different industries. Restaurants and construction are industries with high rates of wage theft, construction with high rates of workplace safety issues. So there's a lot of leverage there that local government has. And then there's also just like public leadership, educating people about their rights. Again, workers' rights education in the public schools, putting information on how to form and join unions on the local government's website. Just really educating people about their rights. So those are a few of the things, a few of the measures that local government can do. We actually wrote, along with Local Progress, a whole report that's basically on that topic: how local government can protect workers' rights when states don't want them to. And we have, these ideas that I've mentioned, as well as a whole host of others, because there really is a lot that local government can do if you sort of just step back and analyze all of the powers of government to support workers. What's different here, though, is that this has not historically been a role of cities and counties, right? Municipal government, like clears the snow and does the garbage and education and all of the libraries, but like protecting workers hasn't been part of its function. But increasingly, I think for a whole variety of reasons, that is changing. And, some of that is because advocates are realizing that there's so much opportunity and potential for movement and positive things happening at the local level. And then I think also right now, in particular with this current administration, we really need every other, economic distress is a big part of why we are where we are right now. And I think that, local government can really play a big part. All parts of government need to, step in where the federal government is not doing its job.
I appreciate all your work on this. I really do. And I know the Local Progress Report that you are talking about. We printed off, our Labor Council printed off 10 copies of it, union printed, and delivered it to all of the city councilors. And I think, did we give one to the mayor? I'm not sure, but we delivered it to all the city councilors, including one of our city councilors in Huntsville is a union member. So I will also be sending her this policy brief and our interview, and so hopefully she'll get some ideas from that. So, and I always appreciate your interviews on America's Workforce. Big fans of Ed over here. So appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Hope that was helpful for folks. Really looking forward to sending this interview and that policy brief. Again, the title of the policy brief is, let's scroll up to the top, Issue Brief, 2025 State Workers' Rights Roundup, Policy Opportunities from Recent Legislative Sessions. So you should also send that to your city councilor.
And your state legislators.
Yep.
right? Because it covers both state and local policies. So there's opportunities in both areas for sure.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.